begin the recording. So everybody, I'm going to be recording this, just so you know. It has just started. And so welcome. This is the monthly CS for Georgia Zoom meeting, conference. And today's topic is on how to address the needs of children with disabilities who are in the K-12 system. And our guest speaker is Maya Israel. And Maya, I will let you introduce yourself so I don't mess up your introduction. It was in the MailChimp description that went out. And so with that, without any further ado, I'll let Maya take it from here. And once again, as I mentioned, we're not going to go around to introductions, so you can just put your name and your organization in the chat. And Maya, all yours.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's make sure. Can you see my slides there? So I'm Maya Israel. I'm faculty. Oh, perfect. So I'm faculty at the University of Florida in Gainesville. I'm in educational technology. I used to be a special ed teacher before I got my PhD, and my PhD is actually in special ed. It's not in computer science education or ed tech, but all of my work centers around technology, universal design for learning, and access in the context of computer science education. So that's I think why you're talking to me today. I have a few slides that I'm going to share, but really what I want to do is be able to have a conversation. So I'm not going to spend more than 10-ish minutes talking at you. But basically, I just wanted to just very briefly talk about the landscape of computer science and students with disabilities. My background is specifically focused on the K-8 space, so I have much less experience at the high school level. We can talk about some of the issues at the high school level, but it's not where my main if that's something that you want to talk about. We're also seeing activities that are integrated into other disciplines. A commonality is that we're seeing a lot of multi-step complex problem solving, and that's just part of what we want kids to have experience with. So productive struggle with activities that allow them to experience debugging and working through challenges that aren't always, have immediate answers to them. The instructional affordances is that you've probably seen this too, is that the students engaged in this typically are really happy to do so. They like the creative problem solving. They're really motivated by the technology platforms. For the most part, unless they're really hitting roadblocks related to accessibility, they think it's fun. So in block-based programming languages, both the inputs and the outputs are very visual. So if you have a visual impairment, you're stuck. And what do you do with text-to-speech and whether things are accessible that way? And then also cognitive accessibility tools and scaffolds aren't really built into curricula and thinking in a broad range of learners. The second issue is related to teacher expectations. We're still finding a lot of bias about who belongs in computer science education. And this is not unique to kids with disabilities. As we all know, this is an issue about who belongs. And students with disabilities, often teachers see that they're struggling and they make assumptions about that being an issue that's internal to the student. So she's struggling because she has a learning disability, rather than she's struggling because the curriculum is not accessible and I don't have the strategies for supporting her. And so that goes with the last little bullet there, which is that teachers don't have a lot of instructional strategies in their toolkit to help them support the widest range of kids that are should be in their classrooms. And so kind of in a nutshell, we're setting up a lot of kids for failure in CS education, and not because of anything to do with the kids. It has a lot more to do with accessibility, instructional strategies, pedagogy, and tools. So just so we're all on the same page here, and I won't belabor this, but we're talking in terms of kids with disabilities, kids receiving special ed services. According to the latest data, we're talking about 13% of all kids in K-12. So this is a pretty large chunk of kids, about 6.5 million kids. This doesn't include the group of students who are receiving services under the 504 section of the Rehabilitation Act. So kids who need accommodations but don't need an IEP. There's another approximately kids in that category. So those are the kids who need things like extended time, who need text to speech or speech to text, but don't need to have special curricular goals to work on with a special ed teacher. The largest category of kids in this group are kids with learning disabilities. So that's about a third, a little bit more than a third. The next category are kids who need speech and language supports, followed by kids who have health impairments and autism. And then another big piece of this, and why I think it's not the only reason why I think it's most important, is that most kids with disabilities spend most of their times in general education classrooms with their peers. So the expectation is that computer science classrooms, all the way from K to 12, will have kids with disabilities in there because they are fully included for most of the school day. They may be pulled out to receive some speech services, but for the most part, they're being educated with their peers using the same standards, taking the same tests, even if they have some accommodations. The good news is that kids are motivated. They really like to do computer science. And teachers, when they're given the right tools, they want to include all of the kids in their classrooms. They want all their kids to be successful. So it's not an issue where there's this teacher bias, and when you point it out, they're like fighting against you. What typically happens is that we are in conversations with them and they say things like, I really want to include her, I just don't know how, or I know I'm not doing enough for her. And so that's actually very good news. It means that most teachers are very open to professional development and support and suggestions about curricular modifications. I wanted to bring up the CS for All accessibility pledge here. I don't know how familiar you're all with this, but there's been a huge movement by our group as part of the CS for All consortium to get researchers, tool developers, school districts, funders to pledge to think about accessibility. And so there are different groups. Like the group that I wanted to talk to you about is the School District, State, and Regional Education Association group. And so we have a bunch of districts and states signed on. And essentially, this is a pledge that these districts and LEAs are going to look at acquiring materials and curricula and technology that is accessible. So to think about accessibility at the point where they are making decisions about curriculum and tools. It also points them to other school personnel that can help with this process. So accessibility and inclusion is a pretty complicated thing, but there are folks at the state, there are folks at the school district level, and in individual schools that have a lot of expertise around assistive technology, around accommodations, around universal design for learning. And so it means finding those people at the district and working with them in order to open those doors for kids who need those extra supports. The third bullet is we don't know what we don't know, which means that we need to really think about how to identify those systemic barriers. Do the districts have data about who's included, who's not included? Are there issues related to when kids are receiving special education services, for example? Are kids being pulled out during computer science instruction time? Do we have the data to see one way or the other? So really identifying those barriers and using data to do that. And then the last piece is to offer professional development to teachers in universal design for learning, accessibility, and inclusion. So districts that have signed the accessibility pledge essentially say, we're not perfect, we're not doing we know we're not there, but we're going to take the first steps in moving the needle towards a more fully inclusive CS experience for all kids. So this is kind of the last couple slides. I just wanted to show you a couple of districts that are started this work. And so Broward County, and I'm new to Florida, but we've been starting to work with Broward County. They've been thinking about how to include all kids. And so one of the things they're doing is that we're having a pilot with 10 dyads of teachers, a gen ed teacher and a special teacher, where they're getting PD together. And so they're able to then not just have the special ed teacher not know anything about computer science. So the special ed teacher typically knows a whole lot about accommodations and modifications, but if the special ed teacher doesn't know anything about computer science, it's very hard for that teacher to provide support and consultation to the gen ed teacher. And the same way, the gen ed teacher won't know about accommodations and universal design. So getting these dyads of teachers together for professional development, as well as investing in some physical robotics, so that if you think about output not always being visual, is one of the things that Broward County is doing to move the needle in terms of more fully inclusive computer science. New York City Public Schools, they've got a different model. They started with this blueprint for K-12 computer science and have built universal design for learning into that blueprint. They've also developed some units with teachers that have universal design for learning features in them, and they've handed those to teachers. And they're also doing ongoing professional development for teachers. And so it's a little bit of a different model, whereas, at one, you've got a small, let's get these teachers with deep expertise and then use those teachers to help support others, as compared to let's develop some materials and bring those materials to teachers. Just so you can see, I'll give you links to all of these. We've been creating examples of how do you teach computer science through the UDL framework. So I'll have a link to this for you. And I'm just creating this list, and it's ongoing about, okay, how can we think about multiple means of representation, or how can we assess kids in more flexible ways so that they can demonstrate what they learn, as compared to demonstrate the fact that they struggle with reading, which is what most assessments do for kids with disabilities. Or for example, how do we think about providing academic language supports in different ways? So we can show kids and do unplugged activities around conditional logic, but there are also some real strong tools to help kids learn vocabulary, and how do we use those from other content areas? This is the FRAIR model, where you have a definition that a student creates, some care. And so it's just one way to think about multiple means of providing instruction to kids. So that's, like, in a nutshell, I wanted to give an overview. And we can go into any of these topics in more detail. But I put up some questions here that I'm hoping we could talk about. And if you have any questions you also want to talk about, we can have the conversations go there. But basically, questions I have are around, what are the barriers? What kind of data do we have or that we need to have? How can we highlight effective inclusion so that the teachers who are doing a really great job are able to showcase that and other teachers could learn from them? And then what kind of resources do you all need, or do you think would be needed in Georgia? So that was all me talking at you.
Great.
And do you want me to leave these up here and keep sharing my screen, or? Okay.
Yeah, initially let's start with your questions. Let's leave your questions up there for the group so we could start there. And once we're done with your questions, we can switch out, stop sharing your screen and let talk amongst ourselves. So anybody on the call want to ask answers or dialogue about some of the questions that Maya is posing here on barriers, data, inclusion, resources? Please go ahead.
Well, I have a question about barriers. It's definitely related to things that we encounter with a lot of the CS instruction, and kind of the reason why we have the CS for all as an approach is because without everybody involved, then you don't get all the perspectives. So a lot of times when you are dealing with special needs students, or the people that address those issues are people that have something personal involved. They have a child, or they themselves, or a friend, or a particular experience, or something like that. And it's that leads them to want to design some sort of an accommodation. Well, if these students aren't being given opportunities, then you don't get that voice. And it's like a cycle. It's like the chicken and the egg thing. Which came first? Is it the fact that we don't have a whole lot of people involved that have experiences, or that we're not giving people with experiences the opportunity to be involved? So I think that's a barrier. Is where do we start first? Start with the teachers, or we start with the students? We start with the. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where to start first.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, right? I mean, so I have a brother with significant disabilities, right? So I think you're right. We have the people who typically care. I mean, a lot of people care, but actually start moving the needle are those who are personally invested. My gut is telling me that you want to start both places, right? But even with a few teachers that have a vested interest, and then moving because there's a capacity issue too, right? So how are you going to deal with a pretty complicated, wicked problem? And you're not just dealing with access for kids with disabilities. You're also, you're confounding that with poverty and issues of, socioeconomic status and culture and gender. I mean, all of these are intersected into a big, complicated issue. I don't know what other people think.
Anyone else have any thoughts? Okay. Maybe Lauren, Maya, we stop sharing your screen and just ask everybody who is on the call. Brian, did you have any questions, things you've been asked about in Georgia, either from school staff, CTAE staff, DOE staff, board members, anything that has come up that's related to disabilities in terms of having the tools, the training necessary? What have you run across that are things that you're seeing or being asked about?
Well, so before now, we have had computer science holistically implemented in K-8. We have new K-8 standards that hopefully will be implemented next month and rolling out next year. So most of the experiences that I've seen are in middle school and high school with CTAE. Now, what I've experienced personally with CTAE is that if you are in a connections course or in a high school elective, which most of the computer science courses are, you're not required to have a co-teacher or a special needs teacher in the classroom with the students. So those experiences is there, you have a teacher that has absolutely no experience with special needs students teaching a classroom full of special needs students, and there's nobody in there to help. I mean, they're not required to be in there to help. Where when I taught math, there was somebody that would come into the classroom and could work the accommodations and things like that. with these courses, we often don't have another teacher in the classroom. So that's another barrier that I've heard about and don't really have an address for at this point.
Yeah, I think that's tricky. I've done the same thing. So how do you, with limited resources and limited time of special ed teachers, have a co-teacher? And I wonder, are para-educators in the classroom? So even if the special ed teacher there, is there a teacher's aide or a para-educator that is involved?
When I taught CTA courses, no, not at all. Now, when I taught math, you would get a co-teacher, and if there were a significant number, you were supposed to get a para. You don't always. I never did. But you're supposed to also get a para in there as well. So you could have 2 other people in the classroom. But with your CTA course, it's neither is required. So often neither shows up.
So I'm wondering if that's a piece of data that can be collected, right? So in terms of advocating for support, if the state and the districts are saying this is important disciplinary knowledge that all kids can get, here's what life of a CS teacher looks like, here are the demographics, like we're including kids, but we don't have the personnel support. Because I would say even if there's no special ed teacher in there, if there can be some professional development for the paraeducators, then that's at least a step forward. It's not a fix, but at least it's something. Because sometimes we'll see paras in CS classrooms, and they won't have any idea how to support the kids. We'll see them, for example, take the computer and do the work for the kids, or just put all the kids with disabilities in the back of the classroom and work with them as a small group. Because of the management issues. And a lot of that is because they don't have the knowledge of what to do. What does education in a CS context look like that's different, for example, compared to math instruction?
And it seems to me, so when I was listening to you talking earlier, talking about block-based coding and how that's very restrictive in regards to students that have a visual impairment. I feel like computer science is an area where we should be able to very quickly address some of these challenges, because the technology has been used historically to address disability challenges and to help and support students with disabilities. We can have multiple input streams, not just the block based. You can have voice activated and all kinds of options as far as input streams and multiple output streams. So if I can't see the code operating on the screen, then maybe the lesson should have something that makes a sound or something that uses a robot or something like that. Like CS sounds, it looks like it should be an easier way to address those challenges. If only everybody had the awareness at the outset when we're designing the curriculum to include those options.
I mean, the good news is that we're moving in that direction. So there are folks like Lauren Milne, who's working in block-based programming for kids with visual impairments, and Andy Stefik has a programming language that really makes sense with text-to-speech. And Bootstrap, they've done a lot with things like ARIA labels, so that you can have at least descriptions of what's happening on the screen. So I think we're seeing more of that. It's just we're not at the point yet where like a teacher would even know what are the affordances from an accessibility perspective when they're making decisions about different platforms and curricula. Yeah. But you'd think so, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it has a leg up in regards to addressing some of these challenges, and just by very nature, even if it hasn't gotten there wholesale.
Yeah, there's hope, but I'm in constant fear that there's going to be lawsuits with classrooms that only have Scratch or only these options where they're just not accessible to all kids.
Yeah.
So Lauren, do you have any questions or any thoughts?
Well, so I have thoughts. I'm not sure if I formulated them quite into questions yet, because I'm trying to pay attention, but I'm also sort of like getting caught in these sort of thought processes, because I'm trying to connect this to So like my background is human-computer interaction. So I'm thinking about how this connects to universal design of learning. And, a lot of times when you think about universal design of learning and what people come up with in that space, it's not really any different in terms of learning outcomes from what happened before. And so I'm thinking, especially when you're asking a question about what data do we need, I'm kind of thinking like, well, if we have these activities that, are just as rigorous and just as have the same learning outcomes as what we've already had, then perhaps if we can demonstrate that these are just as effective for learners, then more people will sort of get on this train and start thinking about universal design of learning and just create curriculum that's accessible to everyone from a more UDL perspective, rather than like trying to create different versions of things. And so that's what I'm thinking about. It's like a question, but I'm just sort of following different thought trains in that line.
It's okay. Maya was trying to be what is it? Thought-provoking?
There we go.
So she's provoking your thoughts.
There we go. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? So how do we demonstrate? So there's this huge myth around, is UDL just dumbing down the curriculum, which is a myth but people think that, right?
Right.
But the idea of how do you demonstrate, like you said, you can have the same learning outcomes and have more engaging, accessible, meaningfully engaging instruction for a broader range of learning. And so how do you demonstrate that, right? And so what does UDL even look like in the context of different instructional materials, because it's so contextualized in the classroom. So if you look at, all of the different options around what you could do from a UDL perspective, you're not going to do everything, right? You're going to see that in your classroom, there are kids who have, whatever learning profiles and background knowledge and challenges and strengths, and you're going to pick from UDL framework to enhance different parts of the curricula. So I'm wondering, though, from your question, how could we do that, right? So thinking about, I don't know. See, now I'm having the same kind of thoughts.
Right. Yeah, I'm wondering that too.
Think about like a specific lesson or a specific activity that is common to computational thinking or computer science, like decomposition or breaking a problem down. So you might have a code.org lesson that requires a student to look at a piece of code and remix it or debug it and find the challenge. But they're looking at it on the screen. So they look at the block code on the screen, and you have to go through and dissect the code. What sort of modifications could you foresee in that scenario that would allow it to be more accessible to more students? I mean, one off the top I can think about is like read the code out loud and kind of describe it, which is an easy one for, again, it's a computer science curriculum that's based online. It should be able to read the code out to the students and let them interact with it audibly.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Or having a really strong model ahead of time, or having a way to look at that code kind of physically first before you're looking at it on the computer. So there are different things that you do to add different ways of representing that content.
Right. Yeah. And I'm trying to sort of reconcile that with, in UDL, a lot of times the device that helps students with exceptionalities is that it is the computer. And so it seems like it should be really easy that computer science should be designed for students with exceptionalities, except that, when you're thinking about a text reader reading code and realizing the limitations of like the human cognitive system of processing that sort of auditory information, it seems impossible, and yet like it should be natural at the same time.
Yeah.
Right, and even things like there's some structure that's built into the code, right? Like when you indent, for example, that tells you something, but a screen reader is not going to know that you're indenting. Or if you have code comments, how are you going to deal with it? So you're right. I mean, these are tricky problems, but we did a study. It hasn't been published. It hasn't been published yet, where we looked at a bunch of teachers' lesson plans and we tagged them by the different UDL checkpoints to see where the gaps were. And so we saw a lot of really good examples of teachers taking curriculum that it didn't necessarily align with UDL, but doing some really wonderful things to add those features into it. So we tagged those. And we saw a lot of ways of adding different ways of representing information, and also a lot of ways of engaging students and wanting them to feel personally connected, and then also have some self-regulation strategies. So they would talk about debugging and how do you like deal with being stuck. The area that we saw the most difficulty was how do you assess learning? And how do you think about multiple ways of having kids demonstrate their understanding? And so that's an area where, in looking at instruction and in thinking about kind of outputs that kids produce, we could be pretty inventive if that was built into systems. But for a teacher to do that, that is pretty complicated. It's a pretty heavy load to put on a teacher anyway, to say, here, take this, learn it, modify it, make it, so, I mean, that's a lot, and teachers want to do it, but when you're having to teach, 6 preps or whatever, you're not going to have a ton of time to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like the burden shouldn't be on teachers to develop that. It's probably going on the curriculum developers and the create the programs. I was thinking about, just when you were saying, if there's a physical way to think about it ahead of time with that particular example.
Mm-hmm.
Pair it with a 3D printer. Like, a lot of times we have particular shapes that are associated with coding block activities. Like, this shape means loop and this shape means execute this type of command. So if you could 3D print them out, and then people could organize them, the students could organize them physically, then you kind of mitigate some of the challenges with the visual on the screen challenge. So just thinking about different ways that we could address it, but it definitely would be something on the curriculum provider's end. So that's where the design is.
Yeah, and that's a great example because, computer science is all about symbols anyway. Mm-hmm. So if you can create physical, tangible symbols of that, I mean, it's the same way that they use tangibles in math education.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Yeah, I think you could even print magnets. Like, right, if you think about those like magnet letters, you could do the same, and that's yeah. So what I'm wondering is, kind of from a CS for Georgia perspective, what do you all see is, like, what are some ways to take first, where do you see the first step being? Do you think it's, and this kind of goes back, Brian, to some of your initial question, like, is it teacher PD? Is it policy conversations?
I had a suggestion. And we don't have to do this, Brian or Lauren, but feel free to nix my idea and go somewhere else if you had a hotter idea. But I was thinking it may be cool to hear from your perspective as we try to engage broad audiences in the school systems, people who have no knowledge about how to improve accessibility for kids with disabilities, for people who have a lot. I think, Brian, I'm getting an idea, Lauren, curious what you think as well, but I think for our work around equity, maybe one of the things we could do, since all issues of equity deals with myths, facts, and resources, right? So I think one of the ways that, Maya, you could be helpful to us, let me know what you think, Brian and Lauren, is for each of our major issues of equity, and there may be others, but of course around race, ethnicity, and then gender and disabilities, and then also, the much larger and sort of difficult to define around low income. Yeah. But those 3 big identity ones. So I was thinking, from your perspective, what do you think are some top 2 or 3 myths around accessibility to CS for kids with disabilities? I think your presentation addressed some of those. And then what are some facts to counter that? Well, that's, or not exactly counter it, but some facts. And then you could, in fact, share your screen and share any resources where people could get started. That if you wanted to get started, we saw the Broward County and New York City example, but feel free to either just mention or search online and say, here's some places you could go as a teacher. And the two groups in the school system I'm thinking of is people and like teachers and curriculum design folks in school systems, and then it's like district folk. Those teachers and principals in a school, and then like curriculum people at the district level. So that's who I'm thinking of for resources. They're like, those are the two buckets of resources. But Brian, Lauren, let me know if you think that.
I like that. There's I met someone, I can't remember her name. Lauren, you may remember her name. She has a organization program and some handouts. That's tools and tips for teaching computer science.
Colleen Lewis.
There we go. We all know Colleen.
Oh yeah.
So something along those lines, but also kind of directed specifically at the subgroups that are challenged or often left out of these conversations.
I wonder if she does have any accessibility.
I've spoken with her, not to the same level. Let me show you. Let's see here. That is not what I wanted to do. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. Escape. Let me share my screen with you for a minute. I'm happy to share some of the resources that we have. I'll just show you really quickly. And I'm in the middle of a grant that hasn't really focused too much on the dissemination part, so bear with me. And this is still Illinois because I haven't, the grant funds from my NSF projects haven't officially moved to Florida. But on one of my grants, which is around kids with disabilities, we're creating these case studies to share with teachers. I'm almost wondering whether we could change these to make them fit what you want, or whether you could use them. And so essentially the way these go, here, let me click on this.
Yeah, find some way to house these on our website.
Yeah, and like in 6 months, I'm hoping that there's a whole lot more. I'm just going to show you the PDF version because it's, so this is an example of a scaffolded project planning. So what we saw a lot of times is that kids with executive functioning challenges and kids who struggle with multi-step complex problem solving have a really hard time planning their projects out. And so all of these have kind of a similar look to them. And so there's some kind of introduction and there's some kind of scenario. So here we've got Mr. Gibson, and he has these 3 kiddos in class, and he's noticing some challenges. And so then there are, taking those challenges from the case study, and there's some common challenges related to project planning. So students struggle kind of strategically planning a project from beginning to end, or they have a really hard time with reading directions. Sometimes what happens, especially even in some of the puzzle-based activities, they're not reading the directions, they're skipping the directions. And so then there's strategies for how you address those challenges, and then examples. And so I have a bunch of those. I've got the PDFs, but then also it's web-based because of screen readers. There's one around universal design for learning, and, it has an illustrative case and even has, like establish clear outcomes, and here's some examples, and anticipate learner variability. So thinking about, some kids who are going to really struggle. This was in the context of math. So they have some issues with the content, and then, thinking about how do you assess. So I have these resources. There aren't a ton of them.
These are great.
But, well, it's a start. It's a start, and they're there's going to be more, I guess. So right now there are 5 and they're drafty still. So I'm happy to share those kinds of resources. There are also, for example, I mentioned Lauren Milne, who's been working with Richard Ladner to create block-based programming that is that works really well with text readers. So there are curricula that I'm happy to also share that's not out of my lab. And Andy Steffik's work. So it's, I'm not the only one doing this work, which is the good news. So.
Coach, we have some, so like the next rollout of the website where we're talking about linking to partners pages, this might be one of the resources we could link to and maybe organize it like you were saying based on the subgroups.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So I think we should have I'm thinking that we should have like an equity and inclusion page that really highlights that topic and empowers people with both knowledge and resources. So yeah, so I think we can figure out whether we do it on the PD or on probably our resources tab is probably going to be a long list.
I think we can reorganize the resources tab and make it, more
less cumbersome. Yeah,
less cumbersome, but it's also easy to navigate to get to those pages. Maya and Lauren, we have our intention. The next rollout of the website is to be able to look at the different curriculum providers and have them kind of just put themselves up there and a brief description of what they do, and then be able to filter based on different criteria. So maybe high school, maybe this middle school, but you could also have a filter that says this particular curriculum is for students with disabilities. This has a visual impairment modification attached to it. So that's another thing that you could filter. And so if somebody's looking for a curriculum to address their students, and their students are within this demographic.
Yeah, and thinking through like a universal design lens, I want to be really careful about the specific tags that we use, because so something for students who have visual impairments could also be good for students who have low literacy rates. And so, I mean, that's something that we face a lot in Georgia. So I don't want it to sound like it's only for students with disabilities and that only special ed teachers should care about these things. I think has a much broader reach than that.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And the way I really think about it is I don't like categories of kids. And so I think a lot about kids' functional need. And so those tags could be something like is accessible by text reader as compared to is something that's good for kids who have or kids who are or has differentiation options. So do you know what I'm saying? So then we're not really focusing so much on this is for kids with autism,
Yeah, because as I mentioned in the beginning, that's exactly what I was going to ask next is how do we talk about it? Because kids have varying types of disabilities and mixes of disabilities. My child's nanny, child had autism, but he was also could not hear, and so you couldn't just categorize him as a child with autism. He had difficulty. No, he was deaf, so he couldn't hear, and so which category do you put him in? And so it's more about So so who could help us or help Brian specifically, since he's trying to help the web developer figure out the filters? Who could help us figure out the languaging around the filter?
Yeah, so folks on our team can help for sure. I have a doc student. Do you all know Todd Lash?
Yes.
I've met Todd.
So Todd's a doc student. He's like brilliant. And,
I didn't know he was a doc student.
yeah. I've been working with him. I've known him since he was a teacher before he went into the dark side of getting a PhD. But this is recorded. But in any case, the idea of functional needs, much more so than categories, to me is much more powerful. It also is much more aligned with the UDL perspective, because UDL is about all kids. It's not just about kids with disabilities. It's reaching the kids who have had all the background experience and they're ready to move ahead. It's for that would be to me much more robust and powerful and equity driven way of tagging.
Okay. well, I would definitely reach out to you and Todd, and when I start to think about what categories and what tags to use.
Yeah, and it's dangerous, right? Because you don't want to say this is an accessible curriculum and this is not, because like you were saying, like, is it compatible with screen reader is one thing as compared to what are some cognitive scaffolds that are built into that, or so we can start thinking about that. And Lauren, I don't know if you want to be part of those conversations too.
Sure.
Great. Well, we are approaching 4:30. Maya, any last thoughts? Brian, Lauren, any last thoughts?
I guess I just want to say thank you for thinking about all CS for all much more broadly. I think at the state level, this is something that could really just showcase what's possible, you know, because districts are trying to figure this out on their own. And so having something, you know, broadly saying, yes, we believe in this and here are supports and resources is really needed.
Excellent. Just so you know what we're going to be up to, you heard about the strategic planning session. We're doing that. And I mentioned to you that we will, Lauren, I can't remember, you're not coming to our strategic planning session, right? I think you said no.
I am.
Oh, you are? Okay, sorry. I'll go look at the spreadsheet. And, so Lauren, just to give you a heads up, we'll be talking a lot about the future of CS for Georgia and how we're going to, there's some good news around how we're going to become more stable with more support from a surprise guest. So Lauren, some exciting news. Make you have some sleepless nights till February 8th.
I love good news.
And so Maya, we are going to do that. And also Brian and I and a couple of the folks are working on thinking about a CS event summit once or twice a year, moving around the state, where we offer PD and we do computer science planning using the CS for All script as a tool. And so Brian's been trained in it. I got trained in it 2 weeks ago with Erica Moore from Tag Ed. So we'll be doing a couple of things to start engaging the rest of the state and developing some tools and resources to help district. So our unit of focus is going to become, like CS for All, focus on districts. Teachers will still be our sort of main audience, main goal to reach them. But in terms of who we interact with, we're going to be working a lot with districts to support them in developing tools like planning tools and curriculum tools and equity related assessment tools or resources. So we'll be doing a lot in building out our website and linking to our partners around the country. We don't need to recreate stuff. Like we're going to highlight your resource. You don't need to recreate all that, particularly if you've set it up so that people can access it easily. We can just describe it and link to it. And so promote on our equity and inclusion page. Brian, Lauren, anything else before we sign off?
Not for me.
Neither. It's been great. Thank you, Maya.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, guys. Thank you so much, Maya. Like I said, this will go. What I'm going to do is write up some notes and send it to. I'll send it to all of you. And if you guys have any suggestions, it'll be a Google Doc, and you can just edit any lessons and resources. And I don't know if you want to just share your slide deck with folks. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to. There are just a few slides.
Okay. So I'll create one with that. And if there's any other links for resources you want to provide, like your website, with a little descriptor as to how people could, what its intention was, what are you trying to do with that page or resources, and then you guys can provide feedback, and then we'll send it out in the next week or so to everybody in our 200 plus MailChimp subscription list, growing longer. So thank you guys.
Sounds good. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.